Hi, my name is Heather Palapple. I'm an artist in Temecula, California. I was recently commissioned to wire wrap Labradorite stones into a cross pendant. But I was surprised to discover there were no tutorials on the internet on how to do so. I couldn't even find any images on the internet of anyone wire wrapping teardrop-shaped Labradorite stones, or any sort of stone, into a cross shape. So I went on a journey to design my own unique design. I started by making a design in Procreate, drawing it out and showing it to the customer for approval. Once he approved the design, I went to work. In this video, I'm going to try my best to show you how I did it. I hope you enjoy my wire wrapping tutorial to make teardrop shaped stones into a cross pendant. Once the design was finished, I calculated out how much wire I was going to need for the project. Then I measured out and cut the wires to the sizes I needed and marked the centers to help me make sure that everything was as symmetrical as possible. I taped together the wires that were working in tandem throughout the project. Once I finished measuring and cutting and marking all the wires I was going to need, I moved on to the next step. Centering the tandem wires to the lowest stone, I wrapped it around and made a bunch of adjustments and tweaks until I got them just where I wanted them. Next, I started winding a thinner half-round wire around the two wires. This client loved the look of wrapped wires, so there will be a lot of wire wrapping in this project. Starting the wrapping of this thin wire around these thicker wires can be a bit of a challenge. I've tried different tools and techniques that I've learned from YouTube videos, but my favorite is to actually start the beginning of the wire with it bent in half and then sort of hooking it on and holding it with my finger and then starting the wrapping process. Once I get it started, it's a whole lot easier. I'll wrap a few winds, then straighten it out with the straightener, and then give it a good pinch with some pliers to make sure it's nice and tight. I continue this process repeatedly. Winding your wire like this is tedious, but the end result is rewarding. Once I finished wrapping just that little section at the bottom, I put it back on the stone and really fine-tuned it. You'll see me pulling it off, putting it back on until I got it just right, and then I marked where it crosses with a piece of tape because as I wind, sometimes it can come a little loose. Once I was happy with the positioning, I continued the wire wrapping process. You'll see me take that tape off on the left-hand side as I continue to wire wrap up to where they intersect. I will skip forward now because this part is very long and tedious. Once I approached the intersection, I gave the winding a good tight pinch and push back to see how far I'd gotten, and then I put it back on the stone to verify where my actual stopping point was going to be. There was still a little more space, so I wound it a few more times before switching to the other side. When I started the other side, I tried to show how I hook that wire, bend it over, and then pull it through. Like I said, this first little part for me is still a bit of a struggle. I am still learning, but by the end of this project, I did get much better at it. So these are the beginning parts, and if it's your first time, you'll probably struggle a little bit like I am here. And you'll see, once I get those first couple winds around, it's much more stable and it's a lot easier to get it to wrap around. I find that doing 2 or 3 turns and then, giving it a good tug, you'll see I'm grabbing the end with one tool and then the other end with another tool to kind of help tighten those first few winds. I'm also a perfectionist, so what you see me doing here is I'm pinching it with the tool, but I'm also pushing it back towards that first wind I did to try to make the transition between the two as seamless as I can. And as I wind, I find making little adjustments, checking it with the stone as I go was a good idea, because sometimes as I gripped it, it would get a little bit distorted. So pausing every so often just to verify everything's where it should be as you wind is, a good idea, and it worked out well for me. So on this side, I decided not to wind all the way to the intersection because I realized once I got all the sides together, I was gonna want this tail to connect everything. So instead of the long tail getting in my way, I decided to put the stone in to hold the shape, and I used the tail to wrap it in and hold it while I wrapped the next two stones. I also took a moment to straighten the wires as much as I can before the next step. Next step was to figure out how the wires were going to wrap around the next two stones. Since all the stones were going to be wrapped with the same wires and intersect in the middle, my goal was for them to weave in and out of each other like a Celtic knot. And I taped the stones in to hold their place. But there was a problem. When I started wire wrapping the right side, I realized that the weaving wasn't correct and I had to fix it. I undid that side and tried to rewire it, but then I noticed the other side was wrong too. But once I quote-unquote fixed it, I realized it was still all wrong. So I took a break to think it through. When I came back from my breather, I accepted the fact that I needed to start over. At first I thought it was just the left side that needed to be redone. But once I straightened it out and went to line it up, I came to the realization that that was wrong too. So here you see me thinking, and this is the process of an artist who's trying to design something that hasn't been done before. After another break and a lot of thinking, I was finally able to figure out my error, and thank goodness it did not involve undoing the other side again. I used my finger as a guide to pull it through, then I lined it up to the stone to make sure it was just the right size and shape. At this point, the wires had got a little kinked, so I did a lot of work to kind of even things out and try to get everything the way it should be. Now back to the wire wrapping. Once I was sure that everything was woven in the center correctly, I went through the tedious process of wire wrapping these two wires all the way around the two center stones. Last but not least, it was time to wrap the top stone. In this one, both wires need to come up either side of the stone, and then I did a little kink at the top to meet them at the top to make the bail later for the chain to go through. It didn't look super pretty at this point, but it's getting there. Then it was time to wire wrap either side. I used the tail of the right side wire wrap when I was done to wrap around the top two to hold them in place, and then put them on the stone to verify that everything still lined up properly. Now it was time to put on the wire that was going to hold the stones in. This is one long new wire that wraps around the stone ends and then comes along the back of the entire piece. As I brought the wire along the back for each stone, I used the tail to wrap it on temporarily while I managed to get everything where I needed it to be. Once the bottom stone was done, you will see I'll take each end and I'll pull it 90 degrees to each side stone. Then I wrap it around each side stone to hold it in at the ends and circle it back to the center. Once I looped it back to the back, I tied it down and I pulled the end up at a 90-degree angle to the top. After repeating that on the other side, it was time to wrap in the top stone. After wrapping one of the wires around the top wires, I used the other wire to wrap it all the way around to match the other ends. Once I was happy with how that looked, I used the end of that one to also wrap around the top bails. Next, I removed the stones, made adjustments, and used the tails of all the wrapped wires to wrap around the center wires. Once I was happy with that and all the wires looked nice and neat and tidy, I moved on to putting the stones back in. As I added the stones, I used my tools to make adjustments as needed to make it look as perfect as possible. Then I moved on to the bail. I start by lowering the wires I'll be using as decoration later and leaving up the two that I will be wrapping to make that loop for the chain to go through. I tie on the same thin half-round wire and I weave it back and forth between the two wires of the bail until I reach the end. There are lots of YouTube tutorials on how to weave your bail, but the one I like the most is basically a figure 8. I wrap it around the one wire once and then cross it opposite to the other wire and wrap around that once and back and forth until I get to the end of how long I want my bail to be. Next, I like to use my finger to wrap around the bail to get it down into that loop that I want it to be. And then I use my pliers to finish off the loop and get it to wrap back on itself to the back of it. To hold it down, I use that half-round wire and I just wrap it around and around a few times just to make sure it stays into place. I trim off any extra wires that might be in my way, and I do know that this wrap doesn't need to be real tight because I will be using the other wires later to hold everything down. As an added detail, I do like to trim off the remaining bail wires and then curl them in opposite directions on the back just to make it feel more finished. Then I use my half-round wire tails to tie them down. And here's what it looks like at this stage. Looking good, right? But there were some areas that didn't look great, so I took some time and I did some tweaking and I just sat there to make sure everything was right where I wanted it to be and looking as good as I wanted it to look. Next, it was time to get those wires down, looking good, and decorating the bail. After twisting one of the wires, I did some swirls. I learned this from some of the YouTube tutorials I had watched when I was first learning, and I absolutely love how it looks, so I do tend to do this now whenever I make a pendant. After making sure the ends were trimmed and tucked in, here's how it turned out. I love it and so does the client. And last but not least, the thinner swirl wires that I put around the tip of each of the teardrop stones. The thicker wires that I had already wrapped on the outside were holding in the stones pretty well, but the tips kept trying to slide out. So I'm glad I thought of that when I originally designed it, and I decided to put these swirly wires on the inside and around the outside edge. And since these swirled pieces are separate wires, I did take the time to use that half-round wire to tie it onto the back posts, and I pulled the wire up to the top just to make everything nice and secure. I also half-round wire tied the ends of the swirls to the sides of the wire wrapping. I repeated this process all around all of the stones and made sure that everything was nice and secure. The last step was just to go through everything, make sure all the curls looked the way I wanted, make sure everything wrapped around the stones the way I wanted, and making sure everything was nice and straight and there were no more wire ends sticking out anywhere to potentially scratch somebody. And here's the final result. Doesn't it look so pretty? This client had been looking everywhere for a cross that was a wired wrap stones, but could not find it anywhere until he found me, and I said, you know what, commission me to do it and I'll make it happen. And what do you think? I think I made it happen. All the wires are nice and clean and secure, and the stones still have their beautiful shine, and the happy client chose the brass chain. Did you learn anything new from my first video tutorial? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed my video, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching.